Howdy. This is going to be an intense section, and I apologize for it. You have a PDF of the Tallinn Manual 2.0 on the international law applicable to cyber operations. I want you to look through the first couple of chapters of it. Let me see, I think I have a slide on, if my slide would forward. Oh, we'll get back to this. We're down to the rest of the semester. We're going to talk about the Tallinn Manual, book chapters 7, 9, and 10. We're going to emphasize privacy and GDPR. And on this one, I want you to be familiar with the manual. I want you to demonstrate an understanding of underlying legal concepts. Remember our first classes when we were talking about jurisdiction, standing, case or controversy, venue, and all that, the who, what, when, why, how. I want you to understand, not in a specific, definite, you're going to go to court legal sense, but I want you to understand the underlying legal concepts. And as that, instead of going through the whole manual, I'm going to highlight the first 3 chapters because those are the foundational. And then I'm going to ask you to spend some time and peruse the manual, go through the manual. For instance, I'm getting ready to give a talk in a conference in Houston on dynamic positioning, which is maritime positioning of different assets in the sea and everything. And so I'm looking at the Tallinn section of the manual on sea law, right? Because that's all different. Even though it's not binding, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, I use it as a reference, and that's what you're going to need to do as well. Now, let me step back because I want to be sure there's a slide here for the rubric for grading semester papers. We've had about a week or so without any lectures while I grade your midterms and take care of other business. I want to be sure everybody's on track with the paper. I believe I finally did get everybody giving me a topic. You know, I'm here for you guys. I'm not getting enough emails. You can email me. I can set up a time to talk. I can, set up a WebEx. My goal, as I've said before, is I'm a professor of practice, which means my goal for you is the first day you are being paid as an employee, you are bringing knowledge I teach you to that job. Okay, I come from industry. I've started small businesses. I know how important it is to have well-trained employees. So this semester paper is a way for you to explore some topic of interest to you. Great topics. I haven't seen one topic yet that I thought, was not a great topic. But if you need sources, if you want to discuss it, hey, I'm here for you. So now let's go on. So we're going to discuss the first few chapters and some aspects of the other chapters. There's a lot here. And what I want you to get out of this is non-binding. It says the Tallinn Manual 2.0 on the international law applicable to cyber operations. Yes, most of it is based on case law, and they can talk about it being applicable, and it may be applicable, but you cannot take this manual and say this manual is the law. It is not. It's not even treaty. It was done by NATO. Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. And even with that, we might disagree as Americans. We're in NATO, but that doesn't mean we always toe everything NATO says for us to do. So I want you to remember this. It says law. That is misleading. Yes, it is based on case law. It talks about case law. It has precedent. But this is like we all sat around the table and said, in a perfect world, this is how we're going to behave. So that's why I want you to take some time, go through the table of contents, pick a few topics of interest and read it. And then say, what can you conclude from this? You do want to be familiar with the basics, the first 3 chapters and an overview of 4 and 5. And the whole idea is you need to be able to use this as a reference manual and just realize it's not the law. But there are international legal frameworks in place. And sometimes it quotes these, which is applicable. But other times it has come up with decisions from their quote, what do they call it? Their experts, group of experts, and like I said, it's more aspirational. So the background is, I won't go through it. You can spend some time because this is going to be a long video anyway. It's not the law. It's not even a treaty. It's somewhat academic. It's not binding, and it's aspirational. And interestingly enough, version 1 was the Tallinn Manual on the international law applicable to cyber warfare. Now they're talking about cyber operations. Same thing. We're not worried about international until, it typically involves a conflict, whether or not it escalates to something we think of as a war. So it's analysis. I took this out of this. The analysis, and I've referenced this. The analysis rests on the understanding that the pre-cyber era international law applies to cyber operations, both conducted by and directed against states. And states, of course, means nation states. This means that cyber laws do not occur in a legal vacuum, and thus states have both rights and bear obligations under international law. So what they're trying to say is we're doing our best to take what's out there and now applying it to cyber era, to the digital era. Sometimes with success, sometimes not with so much success. Just like in the United States, as I've alluded to before, for instance, one of President Obama's executive orders explicitly stated, we don't need new legislation. We need to look at laws in view of cybersecurity. We need to look at existing laws. This is the same thing. Hey, we're not going to sit down and write everything from scratch. We, in fact, have a rich history of legal international laws, and we're just going to apply them to cyber operations because, what could change? Okay, these are some references. I know I get very passionate about this and say, spend some time with GDPR and spend some time with this. These are just a few when I was preparing this lecture last week. I picked up on this, and you want to keep up with it. Tallinn Manual less than, but you do want to be cognizant of it. I'm getting ready to do a workshop at the Bush School from the Army Research Labs North, and I was talking to a person yesterday on the phone, a major, and he even made the comment about, I'm so interested in talking to you what you think about the Tallinn Manual 2.0, right? It's there. It's going to be discussed. It's going to be thought about. Whether it's going to be used or not, we live in a different world. So there's 4 major parts that I've listed here. There's 154 rules. The whole book, if you print it out, is like almost 600 pages, which is why I graciously did not put it as a required textbook. Each of the rules, as being a rule, has commentary on it and where it's coming from. It lists sources ad infinitum. A couple I've picked out. I've got to do for my privacy lecture, for instance, on short form citations. There was the right to privacy in the digital age from the United Nations, and I thought, oh wait, I haven't seen that one. I better look at that before I start talking about privacy. So there's a lot here for you. Each rule, as if you've had a chance to look at it, they discuss it, they reference it. You could spend your life studying this manual. I'm not sure that's a good use of your time. But so, for instance, I just randomly opened to a chapter on conduct of hostilities because, that's worked so well in the past, right? The Geneva Convention, the Warsaw Pact, all those kind of things, right? So attacks against objects, Section 4, Rule 99, prohibition of attacking civilian objects. The rule is civilian objects shall not be made the object of cyber attacks. Cyber infrastructure may only be made the object of attack if it qualifies as a military objective. Okay, I just picked this up randomly right now, but already I see Rule 99. Okay, so what if I attack the power grid? I'm not attacking citizens, but I'm freezing them. I'm attack the power grid and bring it down in the Northeast United States in the month of, say, February, when most homes no longer have backup, right? Your power grid goes out, you don't have a furnace. I grew up in a farmhouse. We had a, fireplace. No, we don't do that anymore. So any rule you pulled out, we could argue about. And quite frankly, if I were just teaching on this, I would divide the class into 2 and say, okay, half of you're taking the pro, half of you're taking the con. And regardless of your personal feelings, state your arguments. So let me give you 2 scenarios that have greatly motivated this. First of all, you'll notice Tallinn is the capital of Estonia. And in 2008, let me go to that scenario first, and I'll go back. In 2007, Estonia was the victim of cyber attacks. Estonia is considered a Baltic republic. There's 3, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And they were somewhat independent. Then they were taken over by the Nazis in World War II. And then after World War II, they were taken over by the Soviet Union. So they don't consider themselves, there's a lot of animosity about what happened to them under both regimes. But they can't live. They're like the little kid on the block. They've got to sell their dairy products to Russia. They can assert only so much independence. So in 2007, Russia wanted to make a point to Estonia, and they only did cyber attacks. They did no physical incursion, and they did no boots on the ground. There was no soldiers coming in. There was no armed conflict. They just did a massive cyber attack, and hackers take down the most wired country in Europe. You know, Estonia is where a lot of great technologies have come from that we use. I've been there. It's a great country. Just be careful. When I was there, it's been 10 years. I had to pay per minute for the internet usage, and their keyboards were obviously not American keyboards. A little tough to do an email that made sense. However, it is the most wired. We have a lot of great Skype came out of there, a lot of great technologies. Okay, so the Soviets made, that's old Cold War terminology. Russia made a statement, and they took down the most wired country in Europe. Okay, Estonia, you're still under our control. Now, a year later, they hit the country of Georgia with cyber attacks before invading. So they hit it with cyber attacks, and I'm not going to go through this because this video is going to be long enough, but I want you to spend some time looking at these sources I put here. So it hit with cyber attacks, and then they had a physical incursion into Georgia. They came into Georgia, army and the like. Now, under the Tallinn Manual, Georgia is considered armed conflict with the appropriate responses, but Estonia is not, because there was no physical attack. This to me is problematic. We are getting to an age where we can conduct war with drones and not put at risk human pilots or robots, you know. So how do you define what a physical attack is going to be? And why should a country like Estonia be totally crippled, have their entire infrastructure compromised by a cyber attack, and yet Tallinn says, oh, sorry, that's not war because there was no physical attack? I'm not sure about that. And just as another one, I found this timeline, 10 years of Russian cyber attacks on other nations. They consider that just another act of acceptable aggression. Okay, so here's the basics. Nation states have developed a body of law that regulates armed conflict. And as I said, and I'm a little bit facetious, and please excuse me, I'm part of the Vietnam War generation. There's still a lot of heartburn there. I have met former prisoners of war who were badly treated. And so whenever they say a body of law that regulates armed conflict, unless both sides play by the rules, the treatment of our POWs, the incursions against civilians, it's almost an oxymoron to say you have a body of law that regulates armed conflict because. So the Tallinn 1.0 was cyber war, 2.0 was cyber operations. And there's a bunch of treaties out there. There's a bunch of case law. You know, we have things like the Geneva Convention. We have all this stuff going on. But we still have, terrible abuses of both civilians and military personnel. So this regulates the use of force by the states. And I'm not going to go through the legal term. I just put it there in case you want to impress someone at a cocktail party sometimes. Which is different than how governed states may conduct their military operations during an armed conflict, and provides protection for various specified persons, objects, and activities. Let me share a personal anecdote with you. 10 years ago this summer, I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, studying law, and it was a great experience. It was through the University of Arkansas. I went to law school late in life. My law school went to Austria. They had Supreme Court justices show up. Good for them. I can get on a plane and fly to Austria. But I sought out a program that was either going to take me to Russia or China. And I go to Russia, and like I said, I studied law and everything. And one of the most moving experiences I've had was going through their museum of the 900-day siege by the Nazis of St. Petersburg during World War II. The museum typically does not have American tourists. People were just staring at us, and the director finally said they're just not used to seeing Americans interested in this. If you don't know that history of the 900-day siege of St. Petersburg, which I think at that time was called Leningrad, Leningrad, and now it's back to St. Petersburg, you realize countries don't play by the rules. They knew it was a civilian population. It's in the very north of Russia. Terrible winters. They circled the city. There was no food that could get in. There was a blockade. I cannot remember the percentage of the civilian population that died of hunger. They had meager rations. So this museum, if you're ever in St. Petersburg, seek it out because it walks you through the 900-day siege. And it really speaks to the strength of the Russian people. When they bombed the city, they didn't have subways at the time, so there was no place to go. There's no place to go. So they bombarded the city. The brutal Russian winters that literally in the spring when the snow thawed, they would find bodies of people that had fallen from hunger or something and couldn't get up. And as they walk you through the 900 days and they tell the story, at the end is where they capture the well-fed Nazis who were part of this. And then that neither side played by the rules. Let me just leave it at that. And I'm not saying what the Russians did to the Nazis after that was right or wrong. If I had been in that, if I had seen family members, but if you don't know the story of the 900-day siege, please look it up. But to me, that is with all the atrocities of World War II, and there were myriad ones, of all the atrocities of a lot of the wars we go on, with Syria now, of all the human atrocities, human tragedies, that is also a story that cannot be forgotten. If anyone wants to ever sit down and talk to me about my time in Russia, I'm interested in it because while we do look at them as someone who still considers himself somewhat of an enemy of the U.S., and that I grew up during the Cold War when our biggest fear going to bed at night as children is that, the Russians were going to attack and make us speak Russian and close our churches. They have a very interesting way of celebrating the heroism of World War II every single day. Whereas in this country, by comparison, we look at it maybe a day or two of the year, right? So I'm off my soapbox. All right, let's talk about the rules. Sovereignty. General principle. Sovereignty. The principle of state sovereignty applies in cyberspace. In other words, what happens within your boundaries happens within your boundaries. You have supreme power, but in certain cases, you can exercise sovereign prerogatives over cyber infrastructure outside the state boundaries, okay? It encompasses physical, logical, and social, that should say layers, not whatever that word is, of cyberspace. Again, what is sovereignty? Well, they go back to 1928 arbitration rule between the Netherlands and the U.S., and they use that definition. All good law, we have clear definitions. So in the sovereignty and the relations between states signifies independence. Independence in regard to a portion of the globe is the right to exercise thereon to the exclusion of any other state, the functions of the state. Okay, I think Netherlands beat the United States in that case, but I could be wrong. So it talks about sovereignty. I want you to spend some time reading through this. Nobody's doing a paper on the Tallinn Manual, which is fine. The reason I'm talking about it is because this will be a topic of discussion. Another aside is I gave a lecture yesterday to some school teachers, and we were talking about how do you prepare their typical age of their students were about 15. How do you prepare them for their work life, which let's say is going to be the next 50 years? And it brought to mind that this past weekend, I sat with my 6-year-old granddaughter and watched the Beatles movie Yellow Submarine, which came out in 1968. And I realized the futility of explaining to her that particular movie, which is a cartoon, was made without digital automated software, that it was hand-drawn, that the old Disney movies were hand-drawn, because you have a 6-year-old who's only ever grown up knowing about watching Netflix and Amazon Prime and on the iPad and taking coding in her kindergarten class, which kind of blows me away, and robotics. And so it's a whole different kind of world, right? So when you look up something back from 1928 that set this definition, at the same time, when we look at this law, my point to these class of teachers just I was talking to is 50 years ago, things were put into place. We could not foresee. No one in 1968 said, this is what the world's going to be like with any kind of accuracy. So we're still struggling with this to say, how is this going to apply down the road? Again, because we can't predict what it's going to be like, right? So this is a good example where they're taking old law, sovereignty, the principle of state sovereignty, and saying, hey, what happens within your boundaries, it happens within your boundaries, and sometimes it has to have sovereignty over cyber infrastructure and activities is abroad. And there's a whole discussion on this. And it's, all these different layers of cyberspace. The physical meaning, can you touch it? The logical meaning, is it the electronic part, the transmission, the storage of data, the processing, the social, how it affects people. And, you know, unless it violates international legal obligations, you pretty much have the authority to do what you want within your state. Okay, sounds great. Within the United States, we can have certain laws, which in Europe, they would say are not strict enough. And we would say, you know what, we're not violating international law, right? We have sovereignty. Now, the second rule is it enjoys sovereign authority with regard to the cyber infrastructure. I guess this is redundant from the last one. But what are the legal operations? When it says, what are the legal obligations that it has, it's free to adopt any necessary appropriate measure. So again, you can do anything you want as long as you don't violate a rule of international law binding on the state, such as, ding, 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 my last video, international human rights law. We have no real agreement on what is human rights. We know that when there are egregious violations of human rights law, but for instance, you have a lot of commentators now and opinions that violate human rights law. Privacy is a basic human right. Well, tell me what that means. So basically, when they say legal operations, again, we're not sure what this means. And we talk about subject to domestic and legal regulatory by the state and the right to protect cyber infrastructure and safeguard cyber activity in its territory. This is a little bit of a digression. I believe I had it on the DMCA lecture, but you need to go back to where there was a case where someone was arrested in the United States for violating something on Adobe. This was years ago, as he was a speaker at DEF CON, and the court ultimately ruled and said, yeah, it's illegal in the United States, but guess what? He did these activities in Russia, and it's not illegal there. So we can't claim jurisdiction based on a legal analysis. Now, I'm kind of giving you the 25 words or less, instead of the 10,000 word opinion. But again, open question, what are the international human rights law or other law, rule of law, international binding on the state? And, what are the rights, but also the legal obligations? So, for instance, we're going to see in the second chapter, sovereignty not only affords rights, okay, so you have the right to do this and this, but also legal obligations, such as requiring due diligence to terminate harmful cyber activities emanating from a state's territory. Let's see, what have we just heard about the Russian hacking? It did exist. It did come from Russia. Did the state of Russia exercise due diligence to terminate that harmful cyber activities? That's just one example. Okay, this all goes back to, this is a complicated topic because it all goes back to business ethics. I used to do a lot of work about 20 years ago in Asia, and I even took a short course on doing business with Asia because there's always this idea that they lie, cheat, and steal. And one of the courses I took, the professor had some real insight, or the lecturer had some real insight when he said, our business ethics are based on our business ethics, right? And in Asia, it's based on the art of war. If you want to understand how to do business in Asia, go read The Art of War, which is a book I always recommend to people to read. And basically, if his analysis was, if they lie, cheat, or steal and you fall for it, it's on you. As American business ethics, we like to say we don't lie, cheat, or steal. So again, when we talk about legal obligations, we're talking about how do we define these? How do we share and understand what those legal obligations are? Third rule, external sovereignty. A state is free to conduct cyber activities in its international relationships as long as it doesn't violate any international law, which in this is the UN Charter. Now, this is a NATO manual, and they're talking about the UN Charter. We need to realize that not all countries are in NATO and the UN, right? Russia, for instance, is in the UN. It's not in NATO. NATO, after the fall of the Soviet Union, picked up a lot of former Soviet republics. I had a friend that was, let's just say, had an interesting career before the wall fell, and you can tell me later he picked up, the first three countries they wanted to pick up was, at that time, Czechoslovakia. It's split, and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but Poland and Hungary, because those had been the best operating for the Soviet Union. So when you talk about the UN Charter, yeah, so that encompasses some but not all countries. And again, NATO encompasses some but not all countries, and it's not proper subsets of each other. So when the UN says states are judicially equal, each state is to respect the other states, there's no legal supremacy of one state or another, sounds great theoretically, doesn't hold up in the real world. I'm going to go through these quickly. Again, I just want you to get a flavor for this. I want you to be a little frustrated. I want you to be a little confused. I want you to read through this and say, this is bringing up more questions than conclusions. And then I will have done my job, because that's exactly what this is doing. So you can't conduct cyber operations that violate the sovereignty of another state. Well, we kind of see that going on, right? And any interference, again, I've got a misspelling here, by a state with cyber infrastructure aboard a platform wherever located that violates sovereign immunity constitutes a violation of sovereignty. So in other words, we have this principles for sovereignty. You have it inside and outside, and then here's the different ways that it can be violated, and you can't do this. If you're familiar with U.S. law, you know you can't sue the federal government without its permission, and there's various ways of getting permission, because it has sovereign immunity, or Texas has sovereign immunity, and this or that. There's always limits on liability, even if you can sue. But sovereign immunity, my son is a corporate bankruptcy attorney in Houston, and occasionally when he's employed by the trustee and he's doing certain actions, and creditors or somebody doesn't like what he's doing and they call him up and they threaten to sue him or get him disbarred, he'll always say, first of all, I'm operating in accordance with the federal bankruptcy rules. If you don't like those rules, then you should go lobby Congress to change them. And second of all, you can't sue us. I'm representing the federal government. We have sovereign immunity. Okay, so due diligence. Due diligence says a state must exercise due diligence and not align its territory, etc., etc. You can read this, cyber infrastructure under its government control to be used for cyber operation that affect the rights of and produce serious adverse consequences for other states. Man, what a great principle. Are we following it? No. Do we assume the United States has cyber attacks? Yes. In a way, yes, we hope so. Do we know China, Russia, these others? Yes. Okay? So you have to exercise due diligence by not allowing it under its government control, right, to be used for cyber operations that affect the rights of and produce serious adverse consequences. All right, very good, aspirational. And your commentary goes, but it's derived from Rule 1, the sovereignty principle. They have the obligation to protect, Okay. You have the obligation of vigilance. You have the obligation of prevention. You have the duty of prevention. In other words, we are also putting an onus on you that if you are doing your due diligence, you are going to adequately protect your systems against attack. You can't just say, hey, you can't attack us because, we have this sovereignty principle in place. You have a obligation, a duty to prevent. It's always interesting to me when countries declare themselves neutral. If you study World War II, Holland declared itself neutral. Of course, and when they were actually invaded by Germany, they thought the initial invasion were planes flying over to invade England. They were very surprised and upset that Germany was violating their neutrality. They had no defense in place to force Germany to respect it. However, why didn't Germany ever invade Switzerland? Besides the fact of the financials, if you ever go to Switzerland, we like to think they're neutral. Well, what does that mean? They a bunch of guys with hippie signs, being peace, love, and all this. No, they are a fortified country, and Switzerland basically put bombs under their bridges and did other things and said to the Germany, "We're doing your banking. You're hiding stuff in Switzerland. We're neutral, but if you do invade us, we are going to destroy ourselves. We will have no value. We will destroy our factories and our infrastructure." Okay, so I always think like neutrality, you better have some something to back it up with. Okay, 7, compliance with the due diligence principle. It requires a state to take all measures that are feasible in the circumstance to put an end to cyber operations that affect the right of and produce serious adverse consequence for other states. I want you guys to be sitting here thinking, why isn't this being done? China knows they have this hacking going on. Russia knows they have this hacking going on. Countries know that they have bad actors operating within their country. If there was true due diligence, why don't they put a stop to it? And that is a good question. And that is why this manual is very aspirational. If, in fact, we lived by these principles, we wouldn't be taking this class because there wouldn't be very many cyber attacks, right? Jurisdiction. So we've talked about sovereignty, due diligence, and now jurisdiction. So it's another take on it. Remember what jurisdiction is. That's the power that an entity, a government entity, can have over territory, right? Now check this. A state may exercise territorial and extraterritorial jurisdiction over cyber activities. What? What do you mean by extraterritorial? All right. And then they get into this taking the state's jurisdiction competence. It can be legislative, it can be executive, it can be adjudicatory, it can do da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, great. We've got a bunch of nomenclature. I'm still stuck on the extraterritorial jurisdiction, which, by the way, is a tenet of GDPR. A state may exercise territorial jurisdiction over cyber infrastructure and persons engaged in its activities in its territory, originating in, completed on in its territory, or having a substantial effect on its territory. The EU somewhere has a rule that says if data is transmitted through EU countries, it comes under EU regulations. Now think about this. I'm not storing data in an EU country. I am sending an email with a document, and it's going to my friends and work associates in Norway, but I don't know where those little electrons go, okay? Well, it says cyber activities originating in or completed on its territory, or cyber infrastructure and persons engaged in cyber activities on its territory. You could argue that this says, hey, EU's got a right? But we have no control over how our data is sent. Okay, so see another problem. We have territorial jurisdiction, but then, let me give you an example of some examples. I forgot I had this. State A deploys a botnet by taking control of cyber infrastructure in State B in order to conduct a DDoS operation against state systems in State C. All three states possess jurisdictional competence. Okay, so A is going to attack C, but they're going to go through B. Just the point I said. Right? Taking control of cyber infrastructure in State B, right? It is being transmitted through the network of State B. All three have jurisdictional competence. Or a state may or may not exercise jurisdiction on the basis of the territorial principle when there's only a minimal connection. So the example they use is data will often traverse the territory of many states en route to the intended destination, but I can tell you the EU has a rule that says if it is transmitted, if it's something about if it's created, stored, processed, transmitted, anything. So they may or may not exercise jurisdiction, but you are seeing countries such as the EU, we don't think is a country, it's a conglomeration of countries trying to act as a country, but they can claim that. Now we get to the extraterritorial jurisdiction, prescriptive jurisdiction. If it's with regard to cyber activities conducted by its nationals, okay, committed on board vessels and aircraft possessing its nationality, conducting by foreign nationals and designed to seriously undermine essential interests, conducted by foreign nationals against its nationals with certain limitations, ding, 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 conducted by foreign nationals against its nationals with certain limitations, or that constitute crimes under international law, subjected to the university principle. I often have questions that say, how can they do extraterritorial jurisdiction? The United States does this all the time. There is a law that says if you kill an American citizen or resident of the United States, a legal resident of the United States, you come under our law if you kill them in a terrorist attack. Okay? There is a case, and I always forget the name, but it happened in India several years ago, maybe 20, 25 years ago. A Pakistani hijacked an Indian aircraft, killed the airline stewardess who was trying to prevent it. Things happened. I can't remember the whole deal while he did it, but at the end, he shoots a bunch of people in the airplane. He gets 15 years in a Pakistani prison. He walks out after 15 years for killing a number of people and hijacking this plane, and he is met by the FBI, who brings him back to the United States because, unknown to him, and I am not saying this is in defense of him, some of the people that he targeting because they were native-born Asian Indians were naturalized U.S. citizens. He is now in Supermax in Florence, Colorado. He has solitary confinement for the rest of his life. He got some big jail sentence, prison sentence, I want to say 150 years, something. And the judge, when he sentenced him, told the victims that were there, the victim survivors, and the victims that had survived, but also the survivors of those who had been killed, if he had it in the power, he would sentence him to death, but he could not sentence him to death. So instead, the federal judge signed an order to put this individual in Supermax for the rest of his life with the express wish that he never again saw another human face. So here was, and I'm not defending him, please don't even 1% think that. However, here's a case where the United States has a law to protect our citizens and legal permanent residents when they are abroad by terrorist attack. And here's an example where it was used. And this person went to prison, and not saying it's in his defense, but he wasn't targeting Americans. But he did not know that I believe 3 of the individuals he killed were naturalized U.S. citizens, born in India, naturalized in the United States. So we do this. We do this. This is not open of can we do it? We do it. And we do it to protect our own citizens. So when we talk about extraterritorial jurisdiction, it's prescriptive, meaning, conducted by its nationals. Prescriptive means kind of like we're telling you how it's going to be. We're not describing it. We're telling you the certain limitations of how it's going to be committed on board vessels and aircraft, foreign nationals, and we've gone through this list. So we can have extraterritorial jurisdiction. Now, again, if we were spending a semester studying this manual, a useful exercise for me to take part of the class and say yes, and someone would say no, but defend this. Or how would we use this to our benefit? Okay, so 9 and 10, there's a difference. The authority of the state to exercise jurisdiction, and addresses the scope of its prescriptive extraterritorial jurisdiction. I'm not going to keep going through these. You can read them. I think you kind of get where I'm coming from. I want you to spend some time. I'm going to put a question on the final on this. I want you to review it. I want you to look at the rules, code, commentary, and decide. I have page 170 marked. Let me see why I have 170 marked. Oh, check out the last paragraph on page 170. The experts were incapable of achieving consensus as to whether remote cyber espionage reaching a particular threshold of severity violates international law. Okay, and I read that paragraph with interest because the experts were incapable of achieving consensus. So, is remote cyber espionage violate international law? So when I say this is aspirational, this is truly aspirational. Okay, I believe that concludes it. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to move on. We're down to 2 more chapters in our book, our semester. I'll get the midterms to you as soon as possible. Thank you for listening.